The spotlight cast sharp shadows across the intimate stage of the Copacabana, cigarette smoke curling through amber light as Frank Sinatra owned every inch of the room. It was November 15th, 1961, and 800 of New York's most powerful people hung on his every word. Politicians leaned back in red velvet chairs, movie stars sipped champagne, and society matrons whispered behind gloved hands. This was Frank at his absolute peak, confident, magnetic, untouchable. He was halfway through My Way, his voice carving through the smoky air with that distinctive blend of vulnerability and strength, when something made him stop mid-verse. In 30 years of performing, through hecklers and technical disasters, nothing had ever broken Frank Sinatra's concentration like this. But there, in the front row of the packed nightclub, sat a tiny woman in a black dress, tears streaming down her weathered face. Rose Martinelli was 92 years old, though she looked even smaller under the stage lights. Her gray hair was perfectly set in waves that belonged to another era. Her small hands clutched a crumpled handkerchief, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. She seemed completely unaware that 800 people were staring at her, completely lost in her own private grief. Frank's voice faltered on the word mention. The band, sensing something was wrong, began to fade their accompaniment. Bill Miller on piano shot a concerned glance at Frank, while the horn section exchanged confused looks. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Frank Sinatra, the man who never showed weakness, stood frozen under the blazing spotlights. The crowd began to murmur. Someone in the back called out, "Keep going, Frank!" But Frank wasn't listening to them anymore. His attention was completely focused on this fragile woman who seemed to be carrying the weight of the world in her tears. Frank set down his microphone with deliberate care and walked to the edge of the small stage. His patent leather shoes clicked against the polished floor as he approached the front row. The crowd's murmur grew louder, confused and slightly annoyed. This wasn't how a Frank Sinatra show was supposed to go. People had paid premium prices to see perfection, not interruption. But Frank didn't care about the crowd anymore. He crouched down at the edge of the stage, bringing himself to eye level with Rose. His face, usually so controlled and confident, showed genuine concern. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible to anyone but her. "What's got you so upset?" Rose looked up at him with eyes that were startlingly blue despite her age, eyes that held a lifetime of joy and fresh, devastating grief. She tried to speak, but could only manage a whisper through her tears. "This was our song," she said, her voice breaking on every word. 52 years ago, my husband Vincent first asked me to dance to this song at the Italian-American Club on Mulberry Street. This morning, I held his hand as he passed away at Mount Sinai Hospital. The words hit Frank like a physical blow to the chest. He stayed crouched there for a long moment, studying this woman's face, seeing something in her pain that reminded him of his own loneliness, despite all the applause and adoration. Behind him, he could hear the crowd growing restless, glasses clicking, chairs scraping, whispered complaints about the disruption. "What was his name?" Frank asked softly, ignoring the noise behind him. "Vincent," Rose whispered, her voice gaining slight strength. "Vincent Martinelli. He was a tailor on Houston Street. Never famous, never rich, but he loved your music more than anything. He said you sang like you understood what it meant to lose something precious, like you knew what real heartbreak felt like." Frank felt his throat tighten. He thought about his own failed relationships, his own struggles with love and loss, the pain he poured into every song. This woman's husband had heard all of that in his voice, had understood something that maybe even Frank himself hadn't fully recognized. "How long were you married?" Frank asked, still crouched at the edge of the stage. 52 years, Rose said, managing a trembling smile through her tears. "He proposed to me while you were singing this very song on the radio. Said if Frank Sinatra could sing about doing things his way, then Vincent Martinelli could too. He was so nervous, but he got down on one knee right there in my father's grocery store." Frank stood slowly, his mind racing. The crowd waited in increasingly uncomfortable silence. Some people seemed genuinely moved by what they were witnessing, but others were clearly annoyed. A man in an expensive suit at table 6 checked his gold watch ostentatiously. A woman in diamonds whispered loudly to her companion about wanting her money back. Frank walked back to the microphone, his steps measured and deliberate. The band looked at him expectantly, waiting for the cue to restart. My Way. But instead of picking up where he'd left off, Frank did something unprecedented in his career. Frank Sinatra, the consummate professional who had never deviated from a set list in 3 decades of performing, made a decision that would define this night forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Tonight's show is dedicated to Vincent Martinelli, who loved his wife Rose for 52 years and who left us this morning. Rose, this is for you and Vincent." What followed was the most intimate performance of Frank's career. Gone were the upbeat numbers, the showstoppers that usually had the crowd on their feet cheering. Instead, Frank sang a carefully chosen set of love songs, each one delivered as if he were singing directly to Rose, as if he were channeling Vincent's voice one last time from somewhere beyond. He started with "The Way You Look Tonight," and Rose's tears transformed from pure grief into something more complex, a bittersweet joy as she remembered her wedding day, Vincent's nervous fumbling with her veil, the way he'd whispered the song's lyrics in her ear during their first dance. Frank watched her face as he sang, adjusting his delivery to match her emotions, turning the performance into a conversation between performer and audience member, unlike anything the Copacabana had ever witnessed. Then he moved into "I've Got You Under My Skin," sung with a tenderness that made hardened businessmen reach unconsciously for their wives' hands. The song took on new meaning in this context, not just romantic obsession, but the way love embeds itself so deeply that it becomes part of your very essence, impossible to remove even after death. When Frank sang "All the Way," Rose mouthed along with every word, her face glowing with memories of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. The entire atmosphere of the Copacabana had transformed. The usual chatter and clinking of glasses had stopped completely. Waiters stood frozen in the shadows, trays forgotten in their hands. Even the bartenders had stopped pouring drinks, everyone transfixed by this extraordinary conversation between a legend and a widow, conducted through songs that suddenly carried more weight than anyone in the room had ever imagined. For nearly an hour, Frank sang only love songs: "The Way You Look Tonight," "All the Way," "I've Got You Under My Skin," "The Best Is Yet to Come," each one chosen specifically for Rose, each one delivered with an intimacy that made the crowded nightclub feel like a private concert in someone's living room. For his finale, Frank returned to "My Way," but this time he sang it completely differently. Not as the usual anthem of defiance and swagger, but as a gentle meditation on a life well lived, a marriage that had endured, love that had lasted through 5 decades of joy and sorrow. He sang it for Vincent, for Rose, for everyone who had ever loved deeply and lost painfully. When the last note faded into the smoky air, the applause was unlike anything the Copacabana had ever heard. Not the usual explosive appreciation, but something deeper, more reverent, more meaningful. Rose stood on shaky legs and clapped with tears streaming down her face, her expression transformed from devastation into gratitude. After the show, Frank invited Rose backstage to his dressing room. They sat together for over an hour, sharing stories about Vincent, about love, about the songs that become the soundtrack to our most important moments. Frank gave her his bow tie from that night, saying Vincent would have appreciated the gesture from one Italian-American to the memory of another. Rose Martinelli lived 2 more years after that night at the Copacabana, and she told everyone who would listen about the evening Frank Sinatra stopped his show for her. More importantly, she said that night helped her understand that Vincent's death wasn't the end of their love story. It was proof of how beautiful it had been. Frank never spoke publicly about that night, but people close to him said it changed how he approached his music forever. He became more aware of who was listening, more conscious that somewhere in every audience were people carrying their own Vincent and Rose stories, their own private joys and heartbreaks, that his songs could touch in ways he'd never fully appreciated. That night at the Copacabana, Frank Sinatra learned that sometimes the most powerful thing an artist can do is stop performing and start caring. The voice that made him famous was impressive, but the man who climbed down from that stage to comfort a grieving widow was unforgettable. In the days that followed, word of what had happened at the Copacabana spread through New York's entertainment circles like wildfire. Columnists called it unprecedented. Music critics struggled to find the right words to describe a performance that had transcended entertainment to become something approaching sacred. Walter Winchell wrote in his column that Frank Sinatra had reminded America what it meant to be truly human. But for Frank himself, the real impact came in the quiet moments. He found himself thinking about Rose and Vincent during other performances, wondering about the stories behind every face in his audience. When he sang love songs now, he thought about couples who had danced to those melodies at their weddings, who had whispered the lyrics to each other during quiet moments, who had found comfort in the music during times of loss. Rose returned to her small apartment on the Upper West Side, but she wasn't alone with her grief anymore. The bow tie Frank had given her sat in a place of honor on her mantelpiece, next to a photograph of Vincent from their wedding day. She began writing letters to Frank, not expecting responses, but needing to tell someone about the memories his kindness had unlocked. "Dear Mr. Sinatra," she wrote in her careful handwriting, "Vincent would have been so proud to know that his favorite singer cared enough to sing for him. You gave me something precious that night. You gave me permission to celebrate our love instead of just mourning its end." Frank read every letter Rose sent, keeping them in a special folder in his dressing room. Her words reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, back when he was just a skinny kid from Hoboken who believed that songs could heal broken hearts. The story of that November night became part of Copacabana legend, passed down from waiters to bartenders to hostesses. New performers would hear about the night Frank Sinatra changed his entire show for one grieving woman, and some of them tried to understand what that meant about the responsibility that comes with having a voice people want to hear. Years later, when Rose Martinelli passed away peacefully in her sleep, her nephew found Frank's bow tie carefully preserved in a velvet box, along with a note written in her shaking hand. "For Vincent, who taught me that love songs aren't just entertainment, they're promises we make to each other." Frank never knew Rose had died until he received a package in the mail containing the bow tie and her note. He stood in his dressing room, holding these artifacts of human connection, remembering the night when he learned that the most important audience for any performer isn't the crowd that cheers the loudest, it's the person who needs the music most.